store all of my fabrics in bins, and every time I cut out a project, any little bit of fabric, it's just so hard to throw away. I keep everything. Sometimes I like to dig into my scrap bin instead of buying new fabric to just see what I can make. I'm just gonna pull out some that I'm just feeling right now. I love going through my scrap bin, and I have made a different project out of every single one of these fabrics. But now I've curated them into kind of seasonal color palettes. So I have my spring line right here. So all of these fabrics are similar weights, and they have colors that cross over. So they kind of group together. And then I did the same thing with these. They all have sort of similar weights and drapes, and I'm crossing, the navies and the greens. And so I'm going to make two different robes, a spring and a fall. I'm going to use this same wonderful robe pattern that you can sew too, but I'm going to show you two different ways to patchwork scrap fabrics together. This is a really awesome project to make. They're all over street fashion wear, street style. Love it. So I'm going to make my own. First one, I'm going to show you how to patchwork the fabrics together before laying out your pattern and cutting it out. And the second one, we're going to cut each different fabric in a different pattern piece and panel them together this way. So I'm so excited to show you how to make both robes. Let's start with the spring one. Now we are gathering all of our fabric scraps and we're cutting them in various sizes. The key is not to make them all really, really tiny, but you want a range of sizes. So I like to do some triangles, and I'm actually going to cut off the selvages. Make a bunch of rectangles, squares, and triangles, not too big or not too small, because we want enough space to make it, patchworky, but we don't want too many little pieces or else it'll just be too much of a tedious task. So I just like to start by going through my fabric and just cutting up different shapes. So after you're happy, grab your pins and we are going to piece this all together. On a clear table, just start placing your fabrics together, slightly overlapping and layering them. Start with just a couple pieces and then just keep adding more and more, pinning as you go. Lay them on top of one another, alternating fabrics so you have a nice difference between them. Make sure not to leave any gaps. Use a lot of pins so everything is nice and secure. Just totally have fun with this. Then once you have a big enough piece of put together scraps, we're gonna take this to the sewing machine and stitch everything down in place along the lines. I'm going to leave all the edges raw to get a fringed effect. You could also serge them first, and then when you top stitch them, turn them under, but for this look, again, I'm going to keep them all raw and just going to top stitch about 1/4 of an inch along every single line. You want to make sure you really have it well pinned before you remove it from the table and take it to the machine. I just finished stitching all of my pieces together. It seems like a lot of work, but it went really fast. Just make sure you use a longer stitch length. That was the key to making it go quick, but still being secure. And things don't catch under as much when you have that little bit longer stitch length. So now it's time for the pattern. For the front robe, I actually need two pieces. So you can try folding it this way and this way to get the best space. This robe pattern has a raglan sleeve line, but you'll see there is a line for the seam allowance, the cutting line and the seam line, so you can easily tape them together to become one piece, because we don't want to be adding too many extra seams on this style of robe. And since it's for summer, I'm actually going to shorten it just a little bit. So I'm going to shorten it about 8 inches or so, and I'll make sure to do that in the back. So I'm just going to fold up this amount. I'm just going to lay it out and cut it as best I can. This might take some finessing. And guess what? If you have a good layout, things are in position. If you have a corner that's sticking up, you know what? You can just cut a little piece off and then just sew it on there. But I'm just gonna try and fit mine on here. I had it fitting before, so you just need to do a little bit of finessing. There, that should be good. Pin your piece down and then do the same process for the back. And then you also have a pocket piece, a belt, as well as a belt casing. So once I cut my pieces out, I'm going to see what fabrics are in the pocket locations. You can see that on the pattern. And then I'm gonna cut these in a contrasting fabric that pops. So just cut out your pieces, 2 at the front, 1 at the back on the fold. And then this is a really simple sew. Just sew the shoulder seams together and then sew the side seams and sleeve seams together. For this one, I'm gonna leave the edges raw. So I'm gonna go cut and sew this out, and then I'm gonna go through more in depth how to actually construct the robe with the facing and the collar and the pockets and the casing with all of my other pieces. Cutting, I'm gonna take these apart now and cutting each piece in a different fabric. So it's a more traditional sewing project. So I have my front pieces, and what I'm going to do before I stitch them together is just stitch along the perimeter to make sure all of the edges are flat. And then I'll cut out the back and just sew them together. And sewn. This one was so easy to make, just 4 seams, and now I can start on my other one. So this one was just like a kind of rough, and I left all the edges raw, but I like the aesthetic for this patchwork style. I kept the edges, like the center front and the seam allowances, all raw, as well as the back casing edges. This just gets top stitched on the back, as well as the pockets. So I left the top open, and as for the pattern, this was the pocket placement. So super easy to sew this one. I didn't sew the facing or the collar, and I just made sure to press my seam allowances open. So now I can wear this as like a beach cover up and just around the house robe. And I love the style, and I can even wear it open in the summer. I just love it. So now I'm going to sew the pattern, cutting each piece. So each, the collar and the pockets and this back casing, I'm gonna cut all of these pieces in separate fabrics and sew it together more traditional to the pattern. But I'm so glad I have 2 different versions. On my pattern, I taped these together because I wanted that one piece for my patchwork fabric. I'm just going to carefully untape them, fold those down, so I can, there we go, get that style line and that fabric paneling look in my separate pieces. So now I'm gonna separate my back. They look quite similar. And then I have my pocket piece, so you'll cut 2 of those. And for this one, you'll also need your back casing and facing pieces, as well as the collar rectangle. So now the fun part is determining where you want to position each fabric. And I'm going to do it asymmetrical. So I'm thinking like the sleeve, one sleeve like this, maybe. You can even stand in front of a mirror and kind of drape on yourself to see, but you can cut it symmetrically as well. So if you wanted like both of your sleeves in the same fabric, but I'm going to cut mine so each side is different. So that means I need to cut each layer separately. So there's a bit more cutting, but I think it'll be worth it in the end. I like to start with my larger pieces of fabric. So you're using scraps, so you want to obviously save those larger ones for the front and the back. So maybe I'll try and cut one sleeve and one front out of this. So this is my front robe, and I'm going to cut one right side up and then one right side down on a different fabric, because you want to have symmetrical pieces. You don't want 2 pieces like this because you need sort of the reverse. So make a note to yourself once you cut one up, the other one down. So I'm gonna cut out all my pieces, and I'm gonna have fun using maybe little scraps for the pockets and the collars. So let's see what I can fit in all my scraps. Starting with your front pieces, you are going to add the pockets. Notice how I didn't serge finish the front edge, and that's just because a facing is going to be attached, and I also left the hems unserged until we sewed them at the end. First, finish the top edge of each of your pocket pieces and then press in the front and bottom seam allowances. The side seam allowances actually get sewn into the garment side seam. Now place them at each notch according to the paper pattern at the side seam and pin with those allowances pressed under. I'm just gonna top stitch them from here down to there and around there, and I'll probably do a basting stitch within the side seam to hold it in place. Do both of your pockets on either center front piece the same way. Again, stitch it down, leaving the top part open. Don't accidentally pin it to the under one. Also, grab your corresponding sleeves and pin each right sides together. Match it up so the neckline is matching and the sleeve matches too. Flip and pin right sides together. When I take this to my machine, I'm going to stitch both of my sleeve seams as well as my pocket seams. For the back piece, I just first stitched the center back seam. Now in the pattern, it is cut 1, but for the sake of piece working them together, I actually trimmed the pattern, and that's why I added the seam allowance on the center back. Sew that seam first, but also press the allowances of your casing piece to the wrong side, and then find that notch along the side seam to place it. But if you accidentally serged off that notch, always have your paper pattern pieces nearby to grab that notch location. I always just pin one of them. Flip the pattern to the other side and pin where the clipping is located on the paper. Now you want to go the seam allowance distance in, so 1/2 inch is where you want this press edge to be. When stitching the casing to the back, don't stitch those ending edges. Just stitch along the top and the bottom because we need to thread the belt through. Also grab your back sleeves and fold them down to pin right sides together. At this top point, stop each seam right at that seam allowance mark. Don't stitch right up into the seam so we get a nice point. So now I can take my front and my back to the sewing machine and stitch all of the seams I just pinned. Press all of your seam allowances open and then pin right sides together, the shoulder seams as well as the sleeves and the side seams matching up the underarm points. Notice at the hem they are different. There's a slit marking, so only stitch to that marking. We are going to stitch now from the top of the slit all the way to the shoulder seam. While you are at your sewing machine, also sew the collar piece right sides together. I didn't interface my collar here because I didn't want it to be too stiff so it could fold under. We are going to sew there and there. We're also going to sew our facing shoulder seams right sides together. So I'm first just going to trim those short allowances of the collar and flip them right side out. Do a tiny poke with your snips, or if you have a point turner. I have one, I just conveniently don't have it with me at my ironing board. And then just press our collar. Collar's ready. Julian, can you? Next is just to press the allowances, those shoulder allowances. Ta-da! Now I'm going to press the allowances of my slit to the wrong side as well. Give everything a nice press. While I'm here, I'm also going to press up my hem allowance. But before I sew it down in place, I'll just unfold it and finish the allowance before. But I'm just gonna press it up in preparation for that. It makes it easy once I serge this edge, I can just take it right to the machine and top stitch it. So once we have all our seam allowances pressed open and our hems pressed up, we need to go ahead and install our collar and facing to finish the neckline and the front edges. I'm just loving my robe so far. Just a few more finishing steps until we can call it done. what I did go ahead and do is just baste the collar along my neckline, and I made sure to start it. My seam allowance isn't in from my center front line. So once that's basted into place along the neckline inside that seam allowance, we can install the facing. So I also serge finished my hems as well as my sleeve hems and pressed those up into place so I can just do all of my sewing at once. And then I also serge finished the outside edge of my facing piece all the way to that bottom hem. So with our collar in place, just lay it right side up, right sides together, starting at the hem. Now you notice I didn't serge finish this hem right here because what I'm going to do is when I sew the hem, I like to have that pressed hem edge right along here because I'm going to start stitching like so and then pivot at my center front. So when I turn it to the inside, it's going to have a really nice finish pin here. So I know to start right there, pivot along up here. Just make sure your collar is down away from you, and then you'll know to pivot right at that intersection right there. And sometimes I like to just fold my back facing in half, right sides together. I'm gonna make a little clip just to get that center back notch. I always like to have my back references so I can match it up with that seam. You'll also want to match up the shoulder seams so you can see the shoulder seam from the wrong side. The collar's sandwiching in between our facing and our robe. All the way down to our other hem. So I'm just going to go ahead and sew all along my facing, and then I'm going to flip it to the right side and then stitch my hem in place and stitch my sleeve hem and then give it a final press. Well, sewing 2 robes is quite the task, so I think I'm going to enjoy this robe right now, relax for the evening, and cheers to using up scrap fabrics. But I might just need to play around with this robe a little bit. Julian, do you want to take some photos?